John had barely taken 3 steps out of the narrow airplane restroom when he heard it, a sharp, slicing voice that cut through the low hum of the cabin like metal against glass. The kind of voice that made everyone freeze for half a heartbeat before pretending not to notice. The aisle lights glowed dimly, flickering off the midnight blue seats and casting a pale shimmer across rows of startled faces. But all John saw was the figure blocking the aisle ahead of him. A heavy-set blonde woman in a black dress patterned with ridiculous candle designs, leaning so far over his grandparents that her hair nearly brushed his grandmother's shoulder. Her voice carried through the cabin with the force of a thrown brick. "These are our seats. Move. Now." "I'm not asking again." His grandfather flinched, gripping the armrests like the plane had hit sudden turbulence. His grandmother's eyes darted toward the aisle, her expression tense but composed in a way John recognized. She was scared, but she wasn't about to give this stranger the satisfaction of seeing that. Standing behind the woman was a young man, Brian, maybe early 20s, slouched in a black hoodie and jeans, hands shoved deep into his pockets, a smirk plastered on his face, as if he were enjoying some private joke. John felt his pulse spike. A few passengers glanced toward him, as if silently handing the problem over. He stepped forward, weaving through the narrow aisle, and every sense sharpened. The recycled air felt thicker, the buzzing engine deeper, the tension almost physical. "What seems to be the problem here?" John asked, keeping his voice steady. The blonde woman snapped toward him so fast her earrings clinked. "Finally, someone who can move them. They're in our seats. My son and I need to sit together. They refuse to switch." John blinked. He looked down at his grandparents, then at her, then at the seat numbers glowing faintly above them. Nothing matched what she was claiming. "These are their assigned seats," he said. "They booked them weeks ago." She scoffed loudly, disgust dripping from every syllable. "Do you think I'm stupid? We were supposed to sit here. We need legroom. My son has long legs. Look at him." She gestured back at Brian, who didn't move except to roll his eyes. Grandpa cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we picked these seats because my wife needs easy access to the restroom. We're not trying to cause any." "Enough," she snapped. "Don't lie. You people are unbelievable." John opened his mouth to respond, but Brian leaned forward, holding up his phone. "Just move," he said. "It's not a big deal." His grandmother stiffened. John saw her fingers tighten around her seatbelt buckle. This wasn't just rudeness. This was intimidation. And the worst part was that they were targeting 2 elderly people who could barely stand up without help, let alone argue with someone like this. "Nancy," John said, catching the woman's name off the luggage tag swinging from her purse. "You need to calm down." That was the wrong thing to say. Her voice exploded upward. "Don't tell me to calm down. Who even are you?" "Their grandson," John replied. Something flashed in her eyes, annoyance mixing with the realization that her bullying might no longer be so easy. She straightened, planting her hands on her hips. "Then maybe you should teach them some manners." "My grandparents don't need lessons in manners," John said, stepping closer, blocking her from leaning over them again. "And they're not moving." Brian scoffed under his breath. "Figures. Whole families entitled." It was loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. A man 2 rows back muttered something, but no one dared speak up. People always froze at moments like these, too afraid of confrontation to intervene, but too invested to look away. The cabin had gone quieter than it should have mid-flight, as if even the engines were listening. John breathed deliberately, forcing himself to stay level-headed. He had dealt with aggressive people before, angry customers, drunks in bars, the occasional reckless coworker. But this woman radiated a specific kind of venom. Entitlement wrapped in outrage, feeding off the assumption that anyone she targeted would cower. He crouched slightly, speaking to his grandparents. "Are you both okay?" Grandma nodded, but her voice trembled. "She startled us, that's all." Grandpa tried to smile, but it was thin and shaky. "We're fine, John. Don't make trouble." John looked back at Nancy. "Let's settle this reasonably." "There's nothing to settle." Nancy snapped. "Move them. I paid good money for this flight. I deserve to sit where I want. My son deserves comfort." "Everyone paid for their seat," John said. You don't get to choose others at random. She jabbed a finger an inch from his face. Don't get smart with me. Brian snickered and leaned forward again, raising his phone as if capturing the moment would somehow validate their behavior. John ignored him and turned to the nearest flight attendant who had hurried over, her expression caught between concern and exhaustion. What's going on here? She asked, eyes moving between them. They stole our seats. Nancy barked before John could speak. That's not true, John said. Check the assignments. The attendant nodded, almost relieved to have something factual to rely on. She asked for boarding passes. John's grandparents immediately handed theirs over. Nancy, however, clutched her ticket to her chest like a toddler, refusing to share a toy. I'm not showing anything until you do your job, she said. I told you these are ours. The attendant blinked, confusion flickering across her face. Ma'am, that's not how this works. Nancy barreled over her words. We have a right to sit together. I'm a single mother. I shouldn't be separated from my child. Brian, who was 22, raised his eyebrows but didn't correct her. John felt his patience thinning. Your assigned seats are probably nearby, he said. Why don't you show your tickets so the attendant can help? She glared at him, lips tightening. You're all ganging up on me. This is harassment. Grandma exhaled, quiet and pained. John saw it. That small sound was enough to flip something in him. Words weren't solving this. Reason wasn't solving this. Nancy had no intention of stepping down or admitting she was wrong. She was escalating on purpose, feeding off the attention. He scanned the passengers again. They watched silently, phones peeking above headrests. The weight of their stares pressed at Nancy, but instead of softening her, it made her louder. She wanted dominance, not resolution. The flight attendant tried again. Ma'am, please let me verify your seats. No. Ma'am, please. I said no. Her shout ricocheted through the cabin. A child somewhere cried. Someone muttered they should eject her from the plane. Brian puffed his chest slightly, emboldened by his mother's volume. John felt the situation slipping toward something bigger, something riskier. Nancy wasn't just angry, she was performing. She needed an audience and wasn't going to back down unless forced. But force would only escalate things further. He inhaled slowly, thinking fast, evaluating. Logic failed. Kindness failed. Authority failed. But Nancy craved one thing, validation. And if she was denied it publicly, her entire stance might crack. He stepped back, eyes narrowing slightly as a plan took shape. Not yet fully formed, but enough to shift the tide. A quiet ripple of anticipation moved through him. If she wanted a spectacle, she was about to get one. And she wasn't going to like the way it ended. He turned to the passengers, staring from every angle, as the beginnings of a strategy sparked behind his eyes. Then, before he could say a word, Grandma reached out, touched his wrist gently, and whispered, "John, do what you must." That was all he needed. And the moment hung there, suspended in the dim cabin light, raw, tense, and on the edge of unraveling, waiting for what came next. The flight attendant stood frozen for a beat, caught between protocol and the escalating chaos unfolding in the aisle. Her palms hovered uncertainly over her tablet, as if the correct procedure might magically appear. Nancy, emboldened by the tension she created, shifted her weight forward, blocking the attendant's view of John and his grandparents, as though physically controlling the narrative would make it true. "We're not moving," Nancy declared. "Not until justice is done." Justice. John nearly laughed at the absurdity of the word coming from her lips. He watched Brian as the younger man lifted his phone again, recording his mother's tirade with renewed enthusiasm. His eyes gleamed with the thrill of going viral, the kind of grin someone wore when they believed the world owed them attention. The low cabin lights reflected off the screen, casting flickering shadows across his face. Passengers leaned in, subtly yet unmistakably, trying to see the spectacle without appearing part of it. Whispered frustrations rose like thin smoke through the rows. Every second was another second the plane couldn't push back, another second of tension coiling around the cabin like a tightening rope. John exhaled quietly, reminding himself that losing his temper wouldn't help his grandparents. He kept his focus on the steps he needed to take next, each one precise, calculated, and necessary. But Nancy struck first. She turned to the attendant again, voice rising. "I want your supervisor. Now. I am being discriminated against." The attendant swallowed visibly. "Ma'am, you need to provide your boarding pass, so I can help." Nancy jabbed a finger at her. "Don't talk down to me. I know my rights." Behind her, Brian shifted his stance and widened the frame of his phone camera. "This will get 1,000,000 views," he muttered, his smugness dripping through his teeth. John resisted the urge to grab the device and toss it down the aisle. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the nearest passenger, a woman in a denim jacket who had been recording since the argument began. She caught his look and held up her phone subtly, showing that she had captured everything from Nancy's first scream. She wasn't the only one. 2 rows ahead, another man angled his camera clearly toward the scene. Good. Evidence would matter. Nancy's ranting continued, filling the cabin like a bitter fog. These people think they're more important. They think age gives them priority. It doesn't. Grandma closed her eyes, pained. Grandpa rubbed her hand gently, murmuring something too soft to hear. John's chest tightened. He needed this to end soon. The attendant stepped back and spoke into her intercom, voice hushed but urgent. A few seconds later, heavy footsteps approached from the front cabin. Murmurs rippled through the rows. Even Nancy paused, shifting slightly, unsure for the first time since the confrontation began. The captain emerged, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a calm, authoritative expression that made the noise around him fall instantly to a simmer. He walked down the aisle with the unhurried precision of someone accustomed to solving problems 30,000 feet above the earth. "What's the issue here?" he asked, voice steady, unamplified, but carrying clearly through the tense silence. Nancy straightened, smoothing her dress dramatically, as if expecting applause. "Finally, someone who can fix this mess. These people stole our seats. I have never been treated so disrespectfully in my life." The captain nodded once, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. His gaze moved to John. "Sir, my grandparents are in their assigned seats," John said. "She's refusing to show her boarding pass." Nancy scoffed. "Don't listen to him. He's lying for them." The captain's eyes shifted to her, cool and analytical. "Ma'am, if you claim these seats belong to you, I must verify that." "No," Nancy snapped. "I don't have to prove anything to you." A wave of disbelief washed through the cabin. Someone whispered, "Oh, come on." Another quietly said, "Kick her off already." Nancy heard the whispers. Her face reddened. She whirled toward the passengers. "You all need to mind your own business." The captain drew a measured breath. "Ma'am, failure to comply with crew instructions is a federal offense. Please provide your boarding pass so we can resolve this." Brian lowered his phone slightly, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Mom, maybe we should." "Shush," she hissed. "I've handled worse." John seized the moment. He lifted his chin, meeting the captain's eyes. "Sir, multiple passengers have recorded everything, including her approaching my grandparents aggressively, blocking the aisle, and refusing instructions." The denim jacket woman raised her phone. "I have the whole thing." A few more hands lifted, holding phones. For the first time, Nancy faltered. Her gaze darted around, nerves briefly surfacing beneath her arrogance. Her voice trembled with controlled fury. "This is harassment. You people are villains." "Ma'am," the captain said calmly, "I will review the recordings." Nancy lunged forward. "No, you will not. That's privacy invasion." "It becomes relevant," the captain replied, unmoved, "when safety and protocol are violated." The attendant collected several phones, including John's. She carried them to the captain, who stepped back to review the footage. Nancy paced, muttering under her breath, fury spiraling into panic. Brian ran a hand through his hair, the smirk long gone. The cabin remained still, passengers watching the captain's face like an audience awaiting judgment. John could see the tension in his grandparents' shoulders easing ever so slightly, but they still gripped each other's hands. Nancy suddenly marched toward John. "You orchestrated this. You think you're clever." John held her gaze. I think you made this happen. She raised her hand as if to point, or perhaps to shove, but the captain stepped between them before she could finish the motion. Ma'am, he said, voice now firm enough to silence the entire row behind him. I've seen enough. Her face paled. What does that mean? It means, he said, that you and your son will need to gather your belongings and deplane. The world seemed to momentarily pause. Even the engine's hum felt distant. The air thickened with held breath. No, Nancy yelled, grabbing the headrest beside her. You can't do that. We're innocent. These old people manipulated you. Passengers groaned in unison. Someone muttered, give it up. Another said, good riddance. Brian swallowed hard. Mom, maybe we should just go. Absolutely not, she screamed. I paid for this flight. I demand respect. You have violated multiple safety regulations, the captain said steadily. Blocking the aisle, harassing passengers, refusing to comply with crew instructions. You will be removed. Nancy's voice cracked. This is unfair. The captain gestured toward the front of the plane. Please walk with the attendants. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an ally, but every face in the cabin stared back with cold exasperation. Even Brian looked defeated now, shoulders slumped. Then the captain gave John a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that justice was unfolding. Nancy's voice thinned into a strangled whisper. This isn't over. John leaned closer, speaking quietly enough for only her to hear. For your sake, I hope it is. The instant the cabin doors thudded shut behind Nancy and Brian, a ripple of relieved whispers swept through the passengers like a quiet tide pulling back from a storm-battered shore. The flight attendants exchanged wary glances, shoulders sinking with the weight of tension finally lifting. The captain stepped forward again, offering a small nod of reassurance before returning to the cockpit. His presence alone seemed to steady the entire plane, as though the space he occupied had absorbed the worst of the chaos. John remained standing in the aisle for a moment, taking in the aftermath. His grandparents watched him with a mixture of gratitude and lingering worry. The cabin lights glowed warmer now, no longer flickering beneath the strain of confrontation. Still, an electric undercurrent lingered in the air, a sense that the echoes of the event were not done shaping what came next. Are you both all right? John asked, bending slightly toward his grandparents. Grandpa let out a slow breath, his hands finally unclenching from the armrests. I've had calmer afternoons, he said, voice soft but steady. But yes, thanks to you. Grandma's eyes glistened, but she blinked the emotion away and mustered a small smile. I told you to do what you must. And you did. John managed a faint smile of his own, though tension still clung to him like static. The sounds of passengers adjusting in their seats, buckles clicking, and overhead bins shutting filled the background. A few people offered John quiet nods of respect. One man mouthed, "Good job." A woman whispered, "Glad someone stood up to her." But John didn't bask in it. His mind remained fixed on something else, the way Nancy had looked at him, wild and threatening, before the attendants ushered her out. That expression wasn't the end of her story. Not with someone like her. It felt suspended, incomplete, like a ticking clock in another room. A flight attendant approached. Her expression softened now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Sir," she said gently, "thank you for staying calm. Your grandparents handled themselves with a lot of grace." Grandma chuckled faintly. Grace is easier when someone else is doing the arguing. The attendant smiled warmly and turned to John. "We're moving you 3 to upgraded seats. Extra legroom, complimentary food and drinks. It's the least we can do after what happened." John nodded appreciatively. "Thank you. Really." A murmur of approval trickled through nearby rows. Passengers shifted aside as John helped his grandparents stand. The attendants guided them toward the front section, where wider seats and softer lighting welcomed them like a balm. The moment the grandparents settled into their new spots, they seemed lighter, as though the storm had washed away some invisible weight. John sat beside them, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin door. Where were Nancy and Brian now? Were they arguing with airport security? Complaining to someone in authority? trying to twist the narrative into something that suited them. He could almost hear Nancy's voice echoing through his memory, shrill, furious, entitled. People like her didn't fade quietly. They erupted, latching onto excuses and grievances like oxygen. He forced himself to breathe slowly, grounding his focus on his grandparents. Grandpa leaned back, eyes closing for a moment. "You know," he said softly, without opening them, "your grandmother might have smacked that woman with her purse if you hadn't shown up." Grandma gasped in mock offense. "I would never. That purse is expensive." John laughed under his breath, tension easing. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, engine vibrations rolling gently beneath their feet. He glanced out the window. The airport lights stretched across the tarmac like scattered stars, flickering faintly under the night sky. For the first time since the ordeal began, a sense of normalcy seeped back into him. But the peace didn't last long. As the plane angled into position for takeoff, the intercom crackled, and the captain's steady voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We had to remove 2 disruptive passengers for noncompliance with federal regulations. Please remain seated as we prepare for departure." A wave of soft chuckles and one outright laugh moved through the rows. Someone clapped once, prompting a brief sprinkle of applause. John's grandparents exchanged amused looks. Even the flight attendants seemed relieved to finally move past the chaos. The plane accelerated, roaring down the runway, before lifting smoothly into the night sky. The pressure in John's ears popped softly. The city lights vanished beneath them as they climbed higher and higher, swallowed by the dark expanse beyond the window. For several quiet minutes, the cabin hummed with tranquility. His grandparents leaned back, hands intertwined, eyes drifting shut. John felt the fatigue settling into him now that the adrenaline had finally bled away. He closed his eyes briefly, hoping to collect himself. But then his phone vibrated. He hesitated before pulling it from his pocket. A message preview flashed across the screen from an unknown number. Interesting timing. He opened it. A single image loaded. A blurry shot of him standing in the aisle earlier, Nancy mid-scream in front of him. And beneath it a message. "You think this is over?" No name. No context. But he recognized the phrasing instantly. Nancy. John's jaw tightened. Of course, she had his number. He'd given it earlier to a passenger who wanted to share recordings with him in case the airline needed them. And if that passenger had posted anything publicly, it wouldn't have been hard for the wrong person to find him. He looked around the cabin instinctively, even though he knew Nancy wasn't there. The dimmed lights cast long shadows over sleeping passengers and quiet conversations. The contrast between the peaceful atmosphere and the threat lurking behind that message made his skin prickle. He leaned closer to his grandparents, so they wouldn't overhear, and reopened the image. It was grainy, rushed, probably captured by Brian before things spiraled. She must have found it, twisted it, clung to it as justification for whatever plan she was stewing over. John's stomach tightened. The plane cruised smoothly, but his thoughts grew jagged again. He needed to be careful. People like Nancy didn't let things go. They clung to grudges with iron claws. He locked his phone and breathed deeply, trying to gauge whether the message was a threat or simply an empty gesture from someone who couldn't accept consequences. His instinct leaned toward the former. She had the look of someone who would twist reality around herself until it snapped in two. Still, he kept his expression calm. His grandparents had been through enough today. They deserved rest, not worry. The flight attendant returned briefly to offer them warm drinks and snacks. Grandma accepted a cup of tea with a grateful smile. Grandpa took a small pack of cookies and promptly fell asleep holding them. John declined the snacks, but thanked her anyway. As the attendant walked away, John glanced at his silent phone again. The plane's interior settled into a soft rhythm, breathing, dreaming, whispering. But beneath that calm surface, something pulsed with unfinished energy. A warning. A thread left hanging. John leaned back in his seat and stared out into the black night sky stretching endlessly beyond the window. The plane glided steadily through it, but his thoughts churned like dark water beneath a calm surface.